So have you possibly noticed that no matter what changes in your life, the struggle seems to follow you? Like maybe you change jobs or you have a different relationship or you move to a different city, maybe a new faith community or you change your therapist or even you change your political beliefs. Or maybe you've spent years reading books, attending workshops, trying to become more patient or confident, trying to find discipline or be more forgiving or more successful, like doing all the things to try and be better, to try and get somewhere. But there's still this, I'm going to say, internal battle going on. Like one minute you feel really confident, and the next minute you're questioning yourself. You're in one conversation and you feel super connected, and then the next one you feel like you're replaying every word after it's over. Like someone compliments you and your mind finds a way to tell you that it wasn't enough, you did it wrong. I mean, it just goes on and on. It doesn't matter what's happening. You're constantly having this inner chatter and it's exhausting. And it's not because life is difficult. Life is difficult. But that's not actually what's exhausting. What's exhausting is that nothing around you is attacking you. And yet we still don't feel at peace. It's as though there's someone inside your own mind constantly evaluating and judging and analyzing, correcting you, comparing with others, warning or protecting you, scolding you, preparing you like for the next mistake or for when you're going to be disappointed the next time, or just anticipating the rejection that's going to come. And because that voice has been there for so long, like you've heard it for so many years that you don't even recognize it. It sounds just like you. And I want to offer a possibility because it's something that completely changed the way I understand not only human beings, but also myself. What if the hardest battle that you have ever fought isn't actually with your circumstances? It's not with your boss, not with your childhood or your partner or your finances or your parents or your anxiety or your whole past. That's not it. What if the war that you've been fighting is actually with yourself? So before you click away thinking this is another video telling you what to fix, just hang with me because that's not what I'm talking about. I don't believe that you're the problem at all. In fact, I don't believe you've ever been a problem. I think something really much stranger is happening. And I think most of us have spent our lives fighting someone who never actually existed. And that may sound really ridiculous, but I'm going to tell you why I believe that. Just hang with me for a second. I want to introduce myself. I'm Leeza Steindorf, and for more than 2 decades, I've worked with leaders in organizations, families, couples, communities around the world that are navigating conflict and change and difficult conversations. And again, what I've discovered is that the deepest conflict is rarely between people. It's the conflict we carry within ourselves. And I'm going to get really concrete about this because if conversations like this help you see yourself more clearly or help you understand things, I'd love to have you join our community, subscribe so you know when new clips come out. Because the reason I believe that most of us spend our lives fighting someone who never existed may be really a super important conversation for you to consider. So let's start really ordinary situation, right? Imagine you're driving home from work or from wherever and someone cuts you off. And immediately your body reacts, your heart starts to race, your jaws tighten, and you tell yourself, what an idiot. And 5 minutes later, you're still having that conversation. Only now, they're not in front of you anymore. Like they've moved on. But your body is still fighting. It's still tense. So about somebody who's disappeared like miles ago. And we've all done that. You're not alone. But here's what's fascinating for me anyway. The event itself lasts like maybe 2 seconds. But that experience that we have with it, it can last like 20 minutes or 2 hours or 2 days or 20 years in some circumstances. And I know this from people I've worked with. So what is it that keeps that tension, that fight alive? It's not the event. It's the story. Our mind keeps replaying it, and then it edits it, and it approves the comeback, or it explains why we're right. It predicts what's going to happen next. And every time it just replays. And each time your body, your whole being is going through the whole situation as though it's happening again. So let's go even more personal. Let's say that somebody criticizes you at work. And again, maybe it lasts like 30 seconds. But afterwards, your mind starts going, right? You're thinking, I should have said this, or they probably think, or I always, or I never, or I can't believe whatever it is. Do you notice something? The criticism actually ended, but the attack didn't. Only now, that attacker sounds just like you, not the person who actually criticized you. And this is where I think we've misunderstood something that is incredibly important. Most people believe that suffering comes from what happens to them, and sometimes it does. Like, trauma is real. I know. I've been through it. Loss is real. Grief, illness, it's real. Violence is real. I'm not diminishing any of those realities. But suffering has this remarkable ability to just keep going long after the event itself has ended. And why? I think it's because something inside us is recreating that situation again and again and again. And it's not because we're weak. It's not because we're broken or dumb or we want to harm ourselves. I think it's because along the way, we've learned that if we constantly evaluate, if we constantly analyze, it's going to keep us safe. So think about that. If I criticize myself first, then nobody else is going to be able to hurt me. If I lower my expectations, like expect the worst, you hear that? I can't be disappointed. Or if I expect rejection, it won't be surprising for me when it happens, right? So if I keep improving myself, eventually I'm going to become someone who deserves love. Like, these are the things that we believe, and we've been taught. Our entire culture pounds that into us. But we've never actually, nobody I know or have worked with has actually decided that that's so. We inherited it from our families and schools and religion and media, culture, advertisement, comparison, whatever. Little bits, but it's constant. It's a constant stream. And so we start believing that our entire value depends on becoming someone else. Thinner, smarter, wealthier, whatever the thing is, right? We have to be somehow more acceptable, more successful, attractive, spiritual, disciplined, confident, whatever. We just need to become more or other. So I'm going to tell you a story. Fascinating. I was facilitating a conflict years ago, and there were two people sitting across from each other. Both of them were intelligent, caring people, and they were both genuinely engaged, willing to solve the problem that they were having. And what they had come from was spending weeks on their own telling each other what the other person was doing wrong. And even when we began, although there's guidelines for mediation session, they started going into that blame of the other person again and again. So each statement, it sounded reasonable. They had evidence, they had their examples, and they could, bolster their perspective. And each one was convinced that if only the other person would finally understand or agree, then everything would be okay. And we weren't getting anywhere. So finally, I asked them a question. And it was not about the other person. I actually asked both of them to consider for themselves. What are you believing about yourself right now? And they both kind of just sat there. Everything got quiet, right? And one person eventually said, I think I'm failing. And after a long silence, the other person also said, I think I'm not enough. And in that instant, the conflict changed, the energy changed. And it's not because they suddenly agreed, but because we had finally found the ground where the argument was really happening. It wasn't between them. It was inside each one of them respectively. And the conversation they'd been having with the other person was being driven by actually conversations they'd had for years with themselves. And once you see that, you start seeing it everywhere. And not just in conflict, in leadership, in parenting, marriage, business, friendships, even, I'm going to say, in the goals that we set for ourselves. Because it's become so much a part of us, right? And it often looks like ambition. But what it really is an attempt to, I'm going to say, outrun who we think we are that we need to stop being. I'm going to clarify that, and if that sounds convoluted, okay? So if you've been fighting yourself all this time, who exactly is the self you've been fighting? Okay? Because I don't think the answer is what we imagine. And I think that really changes things. If you've been fighting yourself, who is the self you've been fighting? Because I think it's actually you. I think it's a version of you. It's a story you've created about yourself, a conclusion that you've come to, often when you've just heard things for years, right? And now you have the maturity to question it, but when you were creating that conclusion and that story about yourself, you weren't questioning it, right? If you think about how young we were when we started forming the idea of ourselves, I mean, kids are naturally expressive, right? We're curious and loud and quiet and disruptive and sensitive and bold and independent and creative and all those things. And none of those characteristics are problems in themselves, but they can become a problem because they don't express themselves in a vacuum, right? Our way of being in the world emerges in relationship, and relationships reflect something back to us. And sometimes that reflection is beautiful, like you get the message you're loved, or you matter, or I'm really glad you're here. But sometimes the reflection is very different, which was my case, and I know it was for a lot of people. You heard, don't cry, be good, don't be so sensitive, stop showing off, what's wrong with you? You should know better. You'll never, whatever, you'll always, whatever, right? So children usually don't have the ability to say, well, that's an interesting projection from an emotionally overwhelmed adult, which our parents probably were most of the time, right? But as kids, we're not doing that. So what we conclude is, it must be me. I mean, that's a logical conclusion. And because belonging is so essential to survival, especially in our families, then children become brilliant at adapting. So if love seems to require us being quiet, then we become quiet. And if acceptance seems to require achievement, then we become achievers. Or if safety requires disappearing, then they disappear, right? Or if they get attention when they do things perfectly, then they become perfectionists. So these ways that we adapt are extraordinary, right? They often protect us. I know they did in my circumstances. They help us, I could say, survive our environments, which we couldn't otherwise navigate. And it doesn't mean that our environment was horrible, but we've been trained. We've taken on the beliefs of those around us, or we've come to conclusions based on how people reflected back to us, right? So I'm not criticizing your parents or family or teachers or spiritual community, nothing. So I don't want to criticize the conclusions that we made. They're often incredibly intelligent conclusions, right? Given the information we had and the interactions that we had, the reflections we got back. And many of them kept us alive emotionally. But here's the problem. What helps us survive childhood does not always help us live a healthy adulthood. We keep using those same strategies even though we're adults now. And the perfectionist is still trying to earn their worth, or the people pleaser is still trying to prevent rejection, right? The person who controls is still trying to prevent pain, or the person who's the overachiever is still trying to become enough, yeah? And the avoider is trying to stay safe, right? So these different strategies and everybody's created their own flavor and way of taking care of ourselves. But the same question is underneath. How do I become someone who cannot be rejected? And if you notice something, none of the strategies begin with the assumption that you're already enough. Isn't that interesting? It's never the premise. Every one of them begins with a hidden premise, really. Something about me isn't okay. And if that premise is false, then every strategy that built upon it actually becomes unnecessary. Not immediately, not overnight, not magically, but fundamentally. And I'm speaking from my own experience. That's why I share this information with you all. I've walked some pretty hard roads. So imagine, as an example, if you're building a house and years later, someone discovers that the foundation was poured in the wrong place. Like there's a fault in the ground and the foundation is in the wrong place. You can repaint the house. You can repaint inside. You can replace the windows. You can install like gorgeous furniture or new lighting. But the foundation hasn't changed any. Eventually, everything begins reflecting that original mistake. And so what I'm saying here is that we've done something similar with our identity. We have spent years building it on a false or flawed foundation, right? Without really examining the assumption that we need to improve anything, right? What if the foundation itself isn't true? What if there's nothing to improve? What if there's nothing wrong with us? So for much of my professional life, I've worked with people in conflict. Conflict and communication has been a big part of the work that I do. I've worked with executives, couples, families, community groups, organizations, teams. And people actually expect conflict to be about communication. And I can understand why that is. They think it's about how we say things, or maybe it's our personalities, or we have different viewpoints on politics, or we're holding different values. And absolutely that can create conflict. I'm not saying it doesn't. But what I've noticed in, I'm going to say, almost all of the conflictual scenarios that I've had the privilege of mediating or facilitating, what I found is that conflict isn't about what happened. It's about what happened means about me. And the other person's thinking the same thing. So that's why two people can experience exactly the same event, and one may walk away completely unaffected, like, okay, good. But the other person may carry it for years. The event matters. I'm not saying that. But in and of itself, it's factual and it's neutral. But what people determine from that, the beliefs they take away from it, those meanings, they're what shape actually how we perceive ourselves. So the event does matter, but the meaning matters even more, because the meaning shapes how we see ourselves. And then how we experience ourselves shapes how we perceive things. And then how we perceive things influences how we behave, and our behavior then impacts our relationships. And then our relationships reinforces the identity we began with. Like it's this perfect loop. And it's not because it's true, it's because we believe it. We've formed that patterning based on those beliefs. So I remember facilitating a dialogue years ago in a group, and someone said something that has really stayed with me since. So he looked at the other person across the room and he said, "You make me feel invisible." And everybody got super quiet. I mean, those are powerful words, right, to say to someone. So I sat with that for a minute, and then I asked him very quietly, "When was the first time you remember feeling invisible?" And his eyes filled with tears, and he was not looking at the man across the room from him. He was somewhere completely different, probably decades earlier. And he started describing his childhood, just really super simply, honestly, and how overlooked he had felt. Yeah. And how often what he was sharing, like what was really important to him, was never even heard. And his conclusion from that was that he simply didn't matter. So you can see what happened, right? The conflict that was playing out between these people in the room wasn't about the meeting that we had gathered to discuss. It wasn't even primarily about the other person. They were a placeholder. That present moment had activated an old conclusion. an old belief about that person. And that conclusion was now interpreting everything that was happening in the room. And that's not weakness. That's how we operate as human beings. And I found that understanding that is so useful. That's why I do this work, is to help us all get clear on what are the dynamics. Because our minds are constantly trying to make the present fit what we've already concluded about ourselves or about the world, right? Like we hold beliefs, which is fine to hold beliefs. But then we try and stuff circumstances into those beliefs even when they don't really match up. So if I secretly believe that I'm not enough, then if I get neutral feedback, it's going to feel like confirmation I'm not enough. Or if I'm believing that people are going to leave me, then if I get a text too late, then I'm going to feel threatened, right? They may be gone. Or if I believe that I'm a disappointment, then if I make one mistake, then there's the proof. See, all I do is disappoint people, right? So the world begins reflecting what we've already internally accepted as a truth or reality, when really it's not factual. It's our beliefs about ourselves. And it's not that the world is doing it. It's because that's the lens we're looking through when we see the world and we see others. So this is why I do not spend much time asking who's right. I'm a whole lot more interested in what's the story here that's trying to protect itself, because stories actually defend themselves, right? They gather evidence and witnesses and they reinterpret events from what actually happened. They become remarkably convincing that it is so. And here's, for me, the most astonishing part. Even when those stories hurt us, like when they're painful, we defend them. Why? Because they're familiar. They're predictable. It fits. We know them. We can operate within them. And that familiarity feels safer than feeling free without them. Think about that. Sometimes we would rather remain with a consistent, known painful situation than really feel free to interpret things as they come at us. And that's not always in the forefront of our mind, right? It's habitual. Because freedom requires not clinging, not holding on to a narrative that we've designed over the decades, even if that narrative about ourselves is painful. So if you're listening and you're thinking, well, great, so now what? I'm just supposed to ignore those thoughts, and there's all kinds of stuff. Oh my gosh, books and trainings and videos and talks and whatever. Just do this and just do that. No, I'm not saying that. Fighting thoughts is simply another war. Arguing with yourself is still fighting with yourself. So what I've come to the conclusion of for myself is I don't want to be in opposition, especially not with myself. I don't want to try and eliminate parts of me, right? That's believing then that parts of me are the enemy or there's something wrong with those parts of me. So I don't believe that healing or that freedom comes by winning the war, conquering our thoughts, or whatever the jargon is. I think that freedom, that liberation, that healing begins by realizing there was never supposed to be a war with ourselves in the first place. At all. I mean, that was huge for me to get. And that really changes the direction of everything else that follows. Because then the question is no longer, how do I become a better person? It becomes, what if the person I've been trying so hard to become has been standing in the way of who I already am? And that's where we're going to go next, okay? Because I want to introduce a distinction that completely transformed how I understand myself and how we human beings operate. The difference between who you are and who you've learned to believe you are. Two completely different things. I don't believe there's just one self, and that doesn't mean we are schizophrenic or whatever, but I believe we have a facet, like a reflective mirror, and there are different ways that we experience ourselves. So one is the one that we've constructed, and the other is the self that we can uncover and remember. And most of us spend our lives trying to improve the first one, right? So what we're longing for is to return to that second one that we can remember, that who we really are. So let me explain that. It sounds kind of all over the place. The self that we've constructed isn't fake. It's real. It has a history, like we have our wounds and our fears, and we have all these strategies for navigating life. That self has learned how to succeed and how to avoid rejection and how to fit in and to survive. It's like our social self, let's say. Yeah? And there's nothing wrong with appreciating that. In many ways, that social self has done extraordinary work. But that's not the whole story of who we are. Because underneath all those adaptations, there's something completely different, and it's bigger and it's quieter. And that self existed before you learned how to perform or how to appease or how to make other people happy or whatever it is, right? Before you learned to compare yourself or to hide. Before you concluded that you had to earn love. And I call that the ground of our being. And I don't mean it's not mystical or religious or anything like that. It's super solid. Because every one of us has moments when we experience that. So think about this. Maybe there's a time where you were so absorbed in something you love, like hiking or working in the garden or holding a little new baby or building something with your hands, maybe. A lot of people feel it when they're creating like artwork, or they're in nature watching the ocean, or with someone they trust, laughing and just relaxing, like where there's no need to be anything. You just are. And in those moments, something disappears. Maybe you experience this as well. It's not like the world suddenly goes away, or you don't have any responsibilities, or you don't have your memories. But the commentary, that constant evaluating and comparing and measuring and rehearsing and defending, like, it's just, you're not, that question isn't there. Am I enough? Am I enough? Am I enough? It's just not there. But you didn't disappear. In fact, most people say just the opposite. I felt more like myself than I have in years, right? When you know that place. The first time I ever experienced that when I was drumming. Oh my God, the first drumming course I ever took, I was drumming. I came out there, I felt like I'd been on vacation because that voice had stopped. And I had that experience of just being without any kind of annotation or analysis. Because when the voice disappears, you're still there, that ground of being. And if that's the case, then the voice is not who you really are. It's a tool. It's a function, but it's not your being. But I do believe it's what most people have mistaken for themselves. And I think that possibility alone is worth sitting with, right? Maybe that voice, maybe that narrative is not my being. It's simply a function of who I am. And one of the great misunderstandings in our culture, from my perspective, and I've traveled the world, in our Western colonized cultures, is that we assume the loudest part of us is the truest part of us. But that's rarely true. Fear is loud. Shame is loud. Judgment is loud. Comparison is loud. The ground of being, the foundation of who we are, isn't loud. It's simply steady. It's there. It might be even silent. Doesn't need to convince you or win an argument, or it doesn't need to prove your worth. It simply is. And because it's quiet and not screaming for attention, most people overlook it. And they mistake silence for the absence of something. Silence isn't absence. It's actually where you have the ability to hear more easily and to be more easily without that tension. So I personally learned this in a way that I never expected. Years ago, I was facilitating, it was only, maybe 6 years ago, I was facilitating a program inside of a federal prison. And if you've never been inside of a prison, it's very difficult to explain the emotional atmosphere, the logistical atmosphere. I mean, it's an intense situation. And you carry a lot of assumptions with you, right? Whether you're aware of them or not, like who deserves compassion and who doesn't, and who can change and who can't, and right, all these things are going on. So one afternoon, an Indigenous elder who was co-facilitating with me asked everyone to become completely still. No talking, no fixing anything, no explaining, just sitting in quiet. And it was extraordinary. There were 9 men in the room, and then the 2 of us. And all of them had committed serious crimes, sitting together in complete silence. And after several minutes, the elder looked around the circle and asked just one super simple question. Who were you before anyone told you who you were? That was powerful, and no one answered immediately. One man began crying, and so did another one, actually. And eventually one of them whispered and said, I don't remember. And that stayed with me. I don't remember who I was before someone told me who I was. And I don't think it's that he forgot like the details of his childhood. I realized actually that I think most of us don't remember, whether they're in prison or not in prison. We've become so familiar with our survival strategies, what I was talking about earlier, that we've mistaken our strategies and our narratives for who we really are, when it's actually only who we've learned to be. And so let me be clear. I'm not saying that we should ignore responsibility and just go off and do whatever we want. I'm not saying that at all. Quite the opposite, actually. The consequences of our choices, they matter. The harm we've caused matters. Repair matters. Being accountable certainly matters. But accountability comes profoundly different when it isn't rooted in self-condemnation. I think one of the reasons that people are so reticent to say, I'm sorry, or I take responsibility for that, is because it's so intricately connected with condemning oneself, with that punitive part of ourselves. So think about how we usually approach change. I need to become less angry, or stop procrastinating. I need to fix myself. There's a hidden assumption behind that. Can you hear it? Something is fundamentally wrong with me. So I need to do something to not be that way. So every attempt that we have at growing and thriving begins with rejecting some part of ourselves. We reject ourselves in order to become more acceptable. Like, that's a pretty strange paradox, right? We're trying to reach self-acceptance by practicing self-rejection. No wonder we're exhausted. Like, how's that ever going to work? Just imagine like you're speaking to a frightened child, right? And you say, you are totally unacceptable, so now you need to become lovable. Like, how is that ever going to work? And we'd recognize how impossible that is, right? But we speak to ourselves that way every day. We call it motivation. Go to the gym. Watch somebody who's trying to achieve something. Go to a school, university, whatever. We call it discipline or self-improvement. But the joy is missing, the desire to learn and to grow and to exercise because we want to. Most people are doing it from that place of war with themselves, that they have to overcome something that they are fundamentally rejecting. And the tragedy, from my perspective, is the more sincerely that we want to become good or better, the more intensely we fight with ourselves. I've seen extraordinarily compassionate people show themselves less kindness than they would offer a stranger. And I've watched brilliant leaders carry private shame that no amount of achievement could overcome. Literally. Like, I've worked with people admired by everybody around them, who people looked up to and thought that they were just flawless. And then we'd be in a session and secretly they would share that if others really knew them, they were certain they'd walk away from them, right? So outwardly, they looked like they had success, but inside there's this conviction that they're not okay, they're not wanted. If they showed who they were, they'd be alone. Because that battlefield is not outside. It's within that social self that we've been carrying. And this is why I believe that our deepest human longing isn't actually happiness or success. I think our real longing is to come home to ourselves and to be seen for that person we are in that ground of being. Coming to someone who's never had to pretend, ever. Didn't need to earn our place or become worthy. You just need to remember who you are. And that's a word I use a lot. Remember. You don't invent it. You don't have to manufacture yourself or achieve anything. Just simply remember. Because I don't think that your true self is something that you create. I think it's something that you stop obscuring with that social self and with all the strategies that we've created with our narratives. And that's why I don't spend my life helping people become someone else. Literally, when people come to me and say, oh, I want to improve or I want to get better, I have this conversation with them first to make it clear that that's not what I can do. I can't help you do that because I don't think it's possible. I don't even think it's necessary. Because who they are, who you are, has always been there. Under the fear, under the performance, underneath the judgment. And once people recognize that place in themselves, that ground of being, then something really, I've seen beautiful happens. They stop wasting their time fighting with themselves. And all of that energy becomes freed up for living and creating and relationship and excitement. I mean, it's like they get this rebirth of who they want to be in the world, right? So, and I'm not exaggerating on this. It's incredibly exhausting and energy depleting to argue with who we are and to try and be someone who we're not. And to believe that who we really are isn't okay is so bad that we would have to become someone else. Not so. So the question becomes, if we stop fighting with ourselves, what do we do instead, right? And this is where I would like to introduce. So the question becomes, if we stop fighting with ourselves, what do we do instead? So what I found is that at this point, when we can come to the place of really believing that who we are is good and valuable and worthy as we are, and the willingness to live into and from that place, the way to get there is through a very simple practice. And I've done it with thousands of people over the years, but for now, let's start with just one simple practice this week. Before you try to change anything, when you notice that either you say, I need to become, or I have to improve, or I'll get better, or whatever it is, listen for that inner critic. Listen for who that critic is telling you need to be. And just ask yourself a simple question. What actually happened? And what story did I immediately start telling myself about myself? What actually happened, the facts, and what story am I telling myself about that situation? And don't try and fix it. Just recognize it. Because that recognition, that awareness, that dynamic even takes place, that's the beginning of the whole thing. That's where you're going to be able to liberate yourself from this pattern of self-attack. Okay? So give that a shot. I invite you to leave your comments below in the comment section. I really enjoy reading them. We're building a really beautiful community here of people that are engaged with their own growth and with one another. And yeah, I appreciate you listening and being present, and I feel honored to be able to share with you. And until next time, be well.